The young man sitting across from me looked strangely familiar. Not familiar like an old friend. Not familiar like a coworker I'd forgotten the name of. Familiar in a way that made my stomach twist before my brain caught up with why. He had my jaw. My mother's eyes, somehow, transplanted onto a face I had never seen before in my life. He sat with his shoulders pulled in, the way I used to sit in waiting rooms when I was his age, like he was trying to take up less space in a world that had already decided he didn't belong in it. He pushed an envelope across the table. Then, after a second of hesitation, the folded paper inside it too. His hands were shaking. Mine were worse. I didn't pick it up right away. I just stared at the numbers printed near the bottom of the page. The kind of numbers that aren't supposed to exist for people like me. People who buried their child before he ever opened his eyes. Why did you tell everyone I died? His voice cracked on the last word. Not from anger. From something closer to exhaustion, like he'd practiced this question for months and still hadn't found a way to make it hurt less. I couldn't speak, because according to my parents, he was the one who died, 22 years ago. The day he was born. I want to tell you that I knew, somehow, that there had always been a part of me that suspected, that some father's instinct had whispered to me across 2 decades. But that would be a lie. And I promised myself a long time ago that I would stop lying, even to make myself look better in my own story. The truth is simpler and uglier than that. I had grieved that boy for 22 years. I had stood at a grave with his name on it. I had spoken to a headstone on his birthday every single year, telling him about my life as if he could hear me from wherever dead children go. And the whole time, 3 states away, he had been alive, growing up, learning to walk, to read, to drive a car, to fall in love, completely unaware that somewhere out there, a man was kneeling in a cemetery talking to an empty box in the ground. To explain how that happened, how a father can mourn a son who never died, I need to go back. Not to the day in that cafe with the shaking hands and the DNA results. 3 years before that, almost to the day, I thought my life was finally about to begin. Her name was Hannah, and she laughed at the wrong parts of movies. I noticed that about her before I noticed anything else. Before her hair, before the way she chewed the end of her pen during lectures, before the small gap in her front teeth that she always tried to hide with her hand. We were both broke college juniors who'd ended up next to each other in an 8 a.m. economics class neither of us cared about. And somewhere between her stealing my coffee and me pretending to be annoyed about it, 3 months turned into 3 years. We didn't have money. We had a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat that smelled permanently of fabric softener, and a mattress on the floor because we kept telling ourselves we'd buy a frame next month, and a joint bank account with $340 in it on our wedding day. My parents weren't thrilled, not because of Hannah specifically, they liked her, in the careful way people like something they've decided not to fight about. It was the timing, the lack of a plan. My mother had a particular way of saying, "Are you sure?" that always managed to sound like a verdict instead of a question. But I was sure. I had never been more sure of anything. We got married in a backyard, folding chairs borrowed from 3 different neighbors. A cake that was slightly lopsided because Hannah insisted on making it herself instead of paying a bakery. I remember standing there in a suit that didn't quite fit, watching her walk toward me, thinking that whatever came next, I had already gotten the best part of my life out of the way early. Everything after this was bonus. I didn't know yet how wrong that thought was. Not because the marriage failed, because of what was coming. We found out about the pregnancy on a Tuesday. Hannah called me at work, which she never did, and when I picked up she didn't say hello. She just said, "I need you to come home," in a voice that made my chest go tight with every wrong assumption a person can make in 4 seconds. I broke about every traffic law getting back to that apartment. She was sitting on the bathroom floor with the test in her lap and tears running down her face. And for 1 terrible second, I thought something was wrong, until I saw she was smiling through the tears, and she just turned the little plastic stick toward me without a word. I don't remember sitting down. I just remember being on the floor next to her, both of us laughing for no reason, the kind of laughing that's really just panic and joy with nowhere else to go. We didn't have money for a nursery. We painted one anyway, a soft, uneven yellow, because Hannah said gray was too sad for a baby and pink or blue felt like betting on something we wouldn't know for months. I built a crib from a kit that took 4 times longer than the instructions promised. and Hannah sat in the corner reading baby name books out loud in increasingly ridiculous voices, until I was laughing too hard to hold the screwdriver straight. We landed on Caleb for a boy. Hannah loved the meaning faithful, devoted, and I loved that it was simple, the kind of name that wouldn't get him beaten up at recess. My mother came by more than usual during those months. She'd bring soup Hannah never asked for, fold tiny onesies with a precision that should have struck me as strange, and sit with a stillness in her eyes that I mistook, at the time, for excitement about becoming a grandmother. I think back now and wonder how much of it was already decided by then. How long she had been watching us, calculating, deciding what kind of life her grandson deserved, and whether two broke 23-year-olds could provide it. I didn't see any of that at the time. I only saw a woman who loved her future grandchild. I was happy. We both were. We had no money, a crib I was still half convinced would collapse, and a future that felt, for the first time in either of our lives, completely solid. Then the labor started 6 days early, and nothing was solid again. It began with Hannah gripping the kitchen counter at 4 a.m., breathing through her teeth, telling me it was probably nothing, in the exact tone of voice that meant it was definitely something. By the time we got to the hospital, the contractions were 11 minutes apart, and her face had gone the color of paper. The first few hours felt almost normal, nurses moving with practiced calm, Hannah squeezing my hand hard enough to leave marks, both of us trying to make jokes between contractions, because the alternative was sitting in silence with the fear. I kept telling her she was doing great. I kept telling myself the same thing, like if I said it enough times it would stay true. Then the monitors changed their rhythm. I didn't understand what the numbers meant. I only understood the way the room changed around them. The nurse who had been smiling a minute earlier suddenly reaching for a phone. The calm voice she used to call for the doctor that didn't quite match the speed of her hands. Within minutes, there were too many people in that room, and someone was telling me, very gently, that they needed to take Hannah back for an emergency cesarean, and that I needed to wait outside. I remember the door closing. I remember a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. I remember sitting in a plastic chair that was bolted to the floor, staring at a clock that didn't seem to be moving, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to since I was 12. I don't know how long I sat there, long enough that the fear stopped feeling sharp and started feeling like something heavier, something that had settled into my chest and intended to stay. When the doctor finally came out, he didn't sit down next to me the way they do in movies. He just stood there, and something about the way he held his clipboard told me before he said a single word. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I'm so sorry." The rest of what he said arrived in pieces. Hemorrhage, complications they hadn't seen coming, everything they tried, a son, a boy born alive but struggling. I don't remember walking into that room. I only remember Hannah's hand, already cooling, and a nurse standing near a small clear bassinet that I couldn't bring myself to look at yet, because some part of me already understood that looking at it would make everything that was happening permanently, irreversibly real. When I finally did look, my son's eyes were closed. His chest was barely moving. A doctor was speaking words I couldn't process, oxygen deprivation, complications during delivery, doing everything they could. I held him for 11 minutes before a nurse gently told me she needed to take him. 3 hours later, my parents arrived at the hospital, and it was my father who told me, in the hallway outside the room where my wife's body still lay, that my son hadn't made it either, that the boy I had held for 11 minutes, the boy with Hannah's small chin and my own stubborn cowlick already visible in the thin dark hair on his head, was gone. I don't remember screaming. People later told me I did. I only remember the floor tilting and my father's arms catching me before I hit it, and thinking, with a clarity I have never forgotten, that I would have rather died in that hallway than continue living in whatever came next. I had no idea, standing there in my father's arms, that the worst part of that sentence wasn't true. My son hadn't died. My parents had simply decided, somewhere in those 3 hours before they walked into that hospital, that he wasn't going to be mine. The coffin was so small that the man from the funeral home apologized for it, as if size were something he could have controlled, as if there were a version of this where the box should have been bigger, and somehow that would have made it bearable. They buried Hannah and our son on the same gray Tuesday, side by side, her casket and his impossibly small one separated by maybe 2 feet of trimmed grass. I remember thinking that 2 feet was both nothing and everything, close enough to touch, far enough that I couldn't hold either of their hands one last time. My mother stood beside me in black, her hand resting on my arm with a steadiness that I leaned into without question. My father stood a step behind, the way he always did at important moments, present but never quite in the frame. I don't remember the priest's words. I remember the sound dirt makes when it lands on a casket, duller than I expected, less like an ending and more like a question that would never be answered. I remember my mother's hand tightening on my arm exactly once. At the moment, they lowered the smaller box, and I remember being grateful for it, because it was the only thing keeping me upright. People came up afterward and said the things people say. So sorry. So young. God has a plan. I nodded at all of it and absorbed none of it. I was 23 years old and I had just buried my wife and my son in the same afternoon, and there was no plan I could imagine that made that acceptable. I didn't know, standing at that grave, that I was the only person there who didn't know the truth. I think about that sometimes. How many people stood in that cemetery already aware that the smaller casket was empty, or close enough to empty that the difference didn't matter to whoever made that decision? How many of them watched me cry over a grave that held nothing of my son but a story? The year that followed doesn't exist in my memory as a year. It exists as a series of rooms. The apartment above the laundromat, which I couldn't afford alone and couldn't bring myself to leave, because leaving felt like erasing the last place Hannah had been happy. The HR office where I told my manager I needed more time, and watched his patience run out roughly 3 weeks faster than my grief did. The doctor's office where a woman with kind eyes asked me, gently, if I'd thought about talking to someone, and I told her I was fine, in the specific tone of voice people use when they are the opposite of fine. I stopped answering calls from friends. Not out of anger, I just didn't have anything left to give a conversation. I'd sit at the kitchen table some nights and realize 4-5 hours had passed without me doing anything except staring at the wall above the sink, the one Hannah had wanted to paint and never got to. My parents were the only people I let in. They came by constantly. My mother cooked meals I didn't eat and left them in the fridge anyway, 3-4 containers deep, like she was trying to physically fill a space inside me with casserole. My father, never a man of many words, started showing up on Sunday afternoons just to sit with me in silence, the television on low, neither of us pretending we were watching it. I remember thinking, more than once, that I didn't know how I would have survived that year without them. I remember being grateful in a way that bordered on reverence, that I had parents who loved me enough to absorb a grief I couldn't carry alone. I didn't know yet that grief was the only thing they were letting me carry. Everything else, they had already decided to carry for themselves. It took almost 2 years before I could hold down a steady job again. 3 before I could hear a baby cry in a grocery store without having to leave the building. I dated, eventually, in the careful, half-hearted way men date when they've already decided the best version of their life is behind them. None of it went anywhere, and I never let it go far enough to find out if it could have. There was always a moment, a woman asking if I wanted kids someday, a friend mentioning a coworker's new baby, where something in my chest would simply close, like a door being locked from the inside. I missed promotions because I couldn't make myself care enough to chase them. I missed a cousin's wedding because the venue had a kids' table and I couldn't sit in the same room as one. I missed, by my own rough estimate, at least 4 years of a life that other men my age were out there actually living. My parents watched all of this happen with what I believed, at the time, was helpless heartbreak. My mother would call every few days just to check in. My father started inviting me to his Sunday golf league, not because I was any good at golf, but because, I assumed, he didn't want me alone with my thoughts on a Sunday. They never once, in all those years, suggested I should move on. They never once told me it was time. I remember being thankful for that too, that they understood grief didn't run on anyone else's schedule. It would be years before I understood the real reason they never pushed me to move on. A man who has moved on starts asking questions. A man who has moved on starts wondering whether the story he was told actually adds up. They didn't need me healed. They needed me grieving, quietly forever, in exactly the shape they had built for me. Every year, on March the 9th, I drove out to that cemetery alone. I never asked anyone to come. It felt like something that belonged only to me, The 1 hour of the year that was still, technically, mine to spend with my son, even if that son was 2 feet of dirt and a small granite stone with a single date on it instead of 2. CALEBBNNETT, the stone read. Born and lost the same day. Beloved son. I would sit on the grass beside it, the way you'd sit beside a person, not a stone, and I would talk to him. I told him about my year. I told him, foolishly, hopefully, about a promotion I'd finally taken, about a dog I'd adopted and then given away 3 months later because the apartment felt too small for both of us, about how his mother would have loved the way the cherry tree 2 rows over had finally started blooming. I never got an answer. I never expected one. That wasn't the point. The point was that for 1 hour a year, I let myself be exactly as broken as I actually was, instead of the version of fine I performed for everyone else. On the 22nd visit, though I didn't know yet it would be the last one where I still believed the lie, I sat there longer than usual. There was a stillness in the cemetery that afternoon, the kind that makes a person feel like they're the only one left in the world. And I remember saying, out loud, to a stone that had never once answered me, I wonder who you would have been. I had no idea that somewhere, 3 states away, a 22-year-old man was asking himself almost the exact same question about me. And that in a matter of weeks, a message neither of us expected would finally bring 2 strangers who shared the same blood into the same room and tear apart everything I thought I knew about the parents who had spent 22 years standing beside me at an empty grave. The message arrived on a Thursday, the kind of ordinary Thursday that gives no warning about what it's about to do to your life. I almost didn't open it. The account had no profile picture, just a gray silhouette and a username that looked like it had been generated rather than chosen, a string of letters and numbers that screamed bot or scam. I get those constantly. Usually I delete them without a second thought. Something made me open this one. I still can't explain what. Hi, I know this is going to sound strange. I'm trying to find information about a hospital record from 22 years ago. Bennett Memorial, March 9th. I think it might be connected to my adoption. I'm sorry to bother you, your name came up in some old paperwork and I didn't know who else to ask. I read it 3 times before any of the words rearranged themselves into something that made sense. March 9th was my son's birthday. Bennett Memorial was where he was born and where he died 4 hours later, in a room I had spent 22 years trying not to remember in too much detail. I typed back with hands that weren't entirely steady. I'm not sure I understand. What paperwork? The reply came almost instantly, like he'd been waiting with his phone in his hand, afraid I wouldn't respond at all. I think I might be looking for my biological father. I was adopted privately, not through an agency, and the lawyer who handled it has passed away. I found his old files in storage after his daughter cleared out his office. Your name was listed as next of kin to the birth mother, Hannah Bennett. I sat with that sentence for a long time before I could make myself read it again. Hannah's name, my name, a private adoption, 22 years. There was no version of that sentence that fit inside the story I had spent half my life believing. He sent a photo before I could find the words to ask for one. It was nothing dramatic, just a selfie, the kind people take in their car or a bathroom mirror, bad lighting, slightly tilted angle. A young man, dark hair, a jaw that was unsettlingly familiar in a way I didn't let myself name yet. I stared at that photo for almost 10 minutes. I kept telling myself it was a coincidence. People share faces all the time. There are only so many combinations of features a human face can have. And statistically, somewhere in the world, there had to be a stranger who looked a little bit like me. Except it wasn't a little. It was the exact tilt of my jaw when I was annoyed. It was my mother's eyes, the pale gray-green I'd inherited and apparently passed forward into a face I'd never seen. I went looking for Hannah's old photos that night, the ones I hadn't touched in years, because looking at them used to feel like reopening a wound that had only just started to scab over. I found one from our wedding, her laughing at something off camera, that exact small chin. The young man's chin. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, the photo enlarged until the pixels blurred, telling myself there had to be an explanation that didn't require my entire life to be a lie. I just couldn't think of one. We agreed to meet, but only after I insisted on a DNA test first. Not because I doubted him. Somewhere in my gut, I think I already knew, but because some part of me needed there to be a scientific, undeniable wall between what I was starting to suspect and what I was willing to actually believe. His name was Daniel. He told me that over a phone call that lasted 11 minutes and felt like 11 hours, both of us circling around the real question neither of us could bring ourselves to ask directly. If you're who I think you are, how is this possible? We mailed our samples to the same lab. Separately, both of us paying for the rushed results because neither of us could stomach the idea of waiting the standard 2 weeks. I went to work that week and have no memory of anything I did there. I answered emails. I sat in a meeting. None of it registered. My entire nervous system had narrowed down to a single point in the future, a results page I refused to let myself imagine, because imagining it felt like tempting a universe that had already taken enough from me. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in my car in a parking lot. Unable to make myself walk into the grocery store I'd driven to 20 minutes earlier. I opened it with my engine off, and my hands shaking so badly, I had to set the phone down on the dashboard to read it. Probability of paternity, 99.98%. I sat in that parking lot for 40 minutes. I didn't cry, not at first. I just stared through the windshield at nothing, while two competing realities tried to occupy the same space inside my chest. My son was dead. My son was alive. Both of those sentences had been true for 22 years, and only one of them could survive the day. I thought about the grave, the small granite stone, 22 birthdays spent talking to dirt. I thought about my parents, sitting across from me at countless Sunday dinners, never once flinching, never once letting a single crack show in a lie that size. And I thought about the boy, the man, now, who was somewhere out there at that exact moment, looking at the same impossible number, trying to understand how a father who was supposed to be dead to him had turned out to be alive the entire time. We agreed to meet 2 days later, at a small cafe neither of us had been to before, neutral ground for two strangers who shared the same blood and 22 years of stolen time. I got there early. I sat at a corner table with my hands folded so tightly together my knuckles ached, watching the door, trying to prepare myself for a conversation I had no idea how to survive. When he walked in, I knew him instantly, not from the photo. From the way he scanned the room exactly the way I would have, searching for an exit before he'd even decided to sit down. He sat across from me. He didn't say hello. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded printout, sliding it across the table like evidence at a trial neither of us had agreed to attend. His hands were shaking. Mine were worse. Why did you tell everyone I died? And just like that, we were back exactly where this story began. Except now I understood, with a clarity that felt like the floor dropping out from under me, that the answer to his question wasn't going to be an accident or a misunderstanding or a hospital's terrible mistake. The answer was going to be my parents. Daniel didn't come to that cafe to accuse me. I understood that within the first 10 minutes, watching him sit there with his shoulders curled inward, asking questions like a man diffusing something rather than detonating it. He wasn't angry at me. Not yet. He was confused in the exact same shape I was, two people standing on opposite sides of the same lie, neither of us responsible for building it. We didn't solve anything that day. We just exchanged what little we knew, agreed it didn't make sense, and agreed to find out together what actually happened in the 4 hours between the moment I held my son and the moment my father told me he was gone. It took us 3 weeks, a records request lawyer, and more money than either of us wanted to spend to get our hands on the paperwork. The hospital records were the first thing to break the story open. A birth certificate, filed and then quietly amended 6 days later. A discharge form for an infant listed as transferred, not deceased. A signature on a private placement agreement that took my breath away before I even registered whose name was on it. My father's signature, not mine, my father's. I sat in that lawyer's office and read it 4 times, waiting for the letters to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They never did. The document was exactly what it appeared to be, a man signing away his grandson's life on behalf of a son who was, at that exact hour, holding his dying wife's hand 3 rooms away. The adoptive family wasn't hard to find, once we had a name. The Whitfields, a pediatric surgeon and a corporate attorney, married 18 years, living in a 6-bedroom house 40 minutes outside the city with a pool, 2 golden retrievers, and according to the records, a long and painful history of failed fertility treatments before a private arrangement finally gave them the son they'd spent a decade trying to have. I want to be honest about something here, because the story doesn't mean anything if I'm not. They were good to him. Daniel grew up loved. He told me about a childhood with piano lessons and family trips to the coast, and a father who taught him to throw a baseball in the backyard until his arm gave out, laughing the whole time. He told me about a mother who still called him every Sunday just to hear his voice. He showed me photos, eventually, birthdays, graduations, a 16-year-old version of himself standing in front of a car his parents had clearly worked hard to be able to give him. Some part of me, sitting across from him hearing all of that, felt something I wasn't prepared for. Relief, almost. Whatever had happened, whatever had been stolen, my son had not grown up in pain. He had grown up safe. That feeling lasted exactly until I understood how he had ended up there. It was Daniel who found the second document, 3 days after the first. He'd gone back to the lawyer's old files himself, looking for anything that might explain why his biological father, me, had supposedly signed away a child while his wife was dying in the next room. What he found instead was a letter, handwritten on my mother's stationery, the same pale blue paper she used for birthday cards, the same careful, looping handwriting I'd recognized my entire life on 1,000 grocery lists and Christmas notes. The letter was addressed to the lawyer, dated the day before Hannah's due date, before the complications, before the surgery, before any of it. In it, my mother explained that her son and his young, financially unstable wife were not in a position to raise a child properly, that she and my father had decided, for the baby's sake, to quietly arrange a more suitable home should anything go wrong with the pregnancy that might leave the young father overwhelmed and alone. She had written that letter while Hannah was still alive, while our nursery still had its half-finished yellow walls, while I was building a crib that took 4 times longer than it should have because I kept stopping to laugh at something Hannah said. They hadn't decided this in a moment of grief, fumbling toward what they thought was mercy. They had decided it before there was anything to grieve. For a while, I told myself I understood the motive, even if I couldn't forgive it. My parents had always believed money solved problems that love couldn't. They had watched their 23-year-old son marry into poverty, watched him struggle, and decided, in their own twisted arithmetic, that a wealthy stranger's house was simply a better bet than mine. It was monstrous, but it was, in its own way, almost understandable. A cold, paternalistic cruelty dressed up as protection. Then Daniel found the bank records. The Whitfields hadn't simply agreed to take a struggling young widower's child out of the goodness of their hearts. They had paid for him $85,000, wired in 2 installments through the same lawyer, the first half before the birth, the second half 6 days after. Once the paperwork was finalized and the boy who was supposed to be dead had a new birth certificate and a new name. I stared at that number for a long time. $85,000. Less than 2 years of my parents' combined income at the time. Enough to renovate my mother's kitchen, which she did 8 months later. The same kitchen where she had cooked me casseroles she insisted I eat while I grieved a son she had personally sold. This wasn't protection. This wasn't mercy dressed up badly. This was a transaction. My parents hadn't decided I couldn't raise my son. They had decided he was worth more to them gone. /document. I drove to my parents' house that same night. Daniel's printed bank records folded into a square so tight it had started to tear at the creases in my pocket. My mother opened the door already smiling, the way she always did, as if some part of her still believed this was just another Sunday. The smile lasted exactly as long as it took her to see my face. "What's wrong?" she asked. "You look. I met my son today." I watched her face for the lie. I'd spent 22 years learning every version of my mother's expressions, the real smile and the performed one, the worry that was genuine and the worry that was for an audience. I was watching for the crack. It didn't come the way I expected. She didn't gasp, didn't ask which son, didn't perform the confusion of a woman who genuinely believed her grandson was buried in a cemetery 40 minutes from where we stood. She just went very, very still. My father came around the corner from the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel, and the moment he saw my mother's face, He stopped moving too. 22 years of careful, practiced grief, and it took less than 4 seconds for both of them to understand exactly what kind of conversation this was about to be. "Sit down," my father said quietly. Not a question, not even really a request. Just a man trying to control the only thing left in the room he still had any power over. "I'm not sitting down," I said. "I want you to look at this." I put the bank records on the kitchen table between us. The same table where my mother had served me casseroles for 2 years while I grieved a boy she'd had a hand in selling. $85,000, I said. "That's what you got. That's what my son cost." My father tried denial first, the way I suppose I should have expected. "I don't know what you think you're looking at," he said, his voice doing the calm, reasonable thing it always did when he wanted to control a room. "Hospital paperwork from 22 years ago, some bank transfer that could be from anyone. It has your signature on it." I didn't raise my voice. I'd promised myself in the car that I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me become the unstable, emotional son they'd apparently decided, 22 years ago, couldn't be trusted with a child. "The placement agreement. Your signature, not mine." While I was in a hallway being told my wife was dead. "We were protecting you," he said. "Protecting him? You were 23, you had no money, no plan. You were protecting $85,000, I said. "Don't call it anything else." That was when my mother, who had been silent for almost a full minute, made a sound I had never heard her make before. Not crying, exactly. Something closer to a held breath finally giving out. "I told myself it was both," she said. My father turned to look at her like she just stepped off a cliff he hadn't agreed to jump from. "Margaret, he deserves to know," she said. And for the first time in 22 years, my mother looked directly at me instead of past me, the way she always managed to do whenever a conversation got too close to something true. "I told myself we were doing it for him. For you, that a young widower with no money had no business raising a child alone, that the Whitfields could give him things we couldn't even imagine. I told myself that for 22 years, every single day, until I almost believed it." "And the money?" I asked. She closed her eyes. "The money made it easier to believe. Once it started, it didn't stop. 22 years of careful silence broke apart in under 10 minutes. The way a dam doesn't crack slowly, it holds, and then it simply doesn't." She told me about the lawyer, a family friend who specialized in discreet placements for clients who could afford discretion. She told me how the Whitfields had been trying for years, how a mutual acquaintance had mentioned their desperation at a dinner party 8 months before Hannah even got pregnant, how my mother had quietly kept the thought in her back pocket like a plan she hoped she'd never need. She told me how easy it had been, in the end, once Hannah died, and I was unconscious with grief in a hospital chair. How simple it was to tell a devastated 23-year-old that his son hadn't survived either, when that 23-year-old was in no state to ask for proof, when the only signature that mattered on any document was a grandfather's, not a father's. "You were in so much pain," she said. "We thought we were sparing you more." "You weren't sparing me anything," I said. "You were managing me. There's a difference." My father, to his credit or maybe just because the lie had nowhere left to go, finally stopped defending it. He sat down at the table he'd told me to sit at minutes earlier, put his face in his hands, and didn't say anything at all. "I want to tell you," I screamed. "I want to tell you I broke something." Turned over the table. Did one of the things a man is supposed to do in that moment. Instead, I just stood there doing math. 22 birthdays. I counted them silently, standing in that kitchen, picturing each one. The cake my mother brought to my apartment every March 9th, to make sure you're not alone today. The candles she helped me blow out for a son who, somewhere else entirely, was blowing out his own candles surrounded by a family that actually knew he existed. 22 Christmases, spent watching other people's children unwrap presents, while I told myself I'd survive the ache by Easter. Every father-son milestone a kid passes through on the way to becoming a man. First day of school, first heartbreak, first car, first job, all of it happening in a house 40 minutes away, while I stood in a cemetery talking to a stone that held nothing but a story. 22 years, I said out loud, mostly to myself. "You took 22 years. We thought it was a mercy," my mother whispered. "It wasn't a mercy," I said. "It was a transaction, and I was the only person in this entire arrangement who never got told the terms." The rest of the family found out faster than I expected. I hadn't planned to tell anyone beyond my parents. Some instinct in me, even furious, still wanted to handle it privately, the way our family handled everything. But my aunt called my mother 3 days later about something unrelated, heard something in her voice that didn't sound right, and pulled the truth out of her in 20 minutes flat, the way only a sister can. After that, it moved like fire through dry grass. My cousins stopped answering my mother's calls. My uncle, who had stood beside my father at countless holidays, told him plainly at a family gathering that he didn't think he wanted his own grandchildren anywhere near a man who'd done what my father had done. My parents, who had spent 2 decades being the most respected, most quietly admired couple in our extended family, the ones everyone called when they needed advice, the ones who hosted every holiday because their house was simply the one everyone gathered at, became, within a single season, the couple nobody wanted to sit across the table from. I didn't orchestrate any of it. I didn't need to. The truth did what 22 years of grief never could. It finally cost them something. Daniel and I didn't talk again for almost 2 weeks after that night, in my parents' kitchen. I didn't blame him. I'd spent those 2 weeks the same way, I think, turning the whole thing over and over, trying to find an angle where any of it made sense, trying to figure out who I was supposed to be angry at when the people who had wronged us both were the same people who had raised me to believe family meant something unshakable. He called on a Sunday. No explanation for the silence, no apology for it either. Just, can we get dinner? Not to talk about them, just to talk. We met at a small Italian place he picked, somewhere with low lighting and no expectations attached to it. For the first 20 minutes, we talked about nothing that mattered, his job, mine, a baseball team he followed that I didn't. The kind of conversation 2 strangers have when they're both circling something neither of them is ready to touch yet. Then, somewhere between the appetizers and the entrees, he set his fork down and looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately, because I'd worn it myself 100 times. The look of a person who has been carrying one question so long it started to hurt more than the answer ever could. "Did you really think I was dead?" he asked. "All those years, you actually believed it. It wasn't an accusation." I understood that even as the question landed somewhere just beneath my ribs, he wasn't asking whether I'd participated. He was asking something smaller and somehow harder, whether the grief he'd glimpsed in my face that first day at the cafe had been real, or whether some part of me had always known, some father's instinct that had simply chosen silence. "Every year," I said, "on your birthday, I drove to a cemetery and sat next to a headstone with your name on it. I talked to you. I told you about my year. I told you things I never told another living person because I thought you were the one person who couldn't judge me for them." He didn't say anything. He just watched me, the way he had in the cafe, scanning for whatever truth he could find in my face that he couldn't find anywhere else. "I have every letter," I said. "I used to write you one every year and leave it in a box at home, because I couldn't stand the idea of burying paper in the ground with nothing on it for you to actually read. 22 letters. I have every single one." His eyes were wet by the time I finished. So were mine. Neither of us tried to hide it, not in that small restaurant, not from each other. "I believed it completely," I said. "I'm not going to pretend that makes anything better. But I need you to know, whatever they took from both of us, they didn't take it from a father who didn't care. They took it from a father who would have given anything, every single day for 22 years, to have you back." "I know," he said quietly. "I think I knew that the second you started talking about the cemetery. We didn't fix everything in that dinner. I don't think grief and 22 stolen years work that way. There was no single conversation big enough to undo what had been taken. No apology shaped correctly enough to give either of us back the birthdays we'd actually missed. But it was a start. The first honest thing either of us had been handed in this entire story. We started slowly. Dinners, then phone calls that didn't need a reason, then a weekend where he came to stay at my place, and we stayed up until 2 a.m., trading the smaller stories nobody had thought to tell us before. What kind of kid he'd been, stubborn about the wrong things, terrified of thunderstorms until he was almost 10. What kind of woman his mother had been, how she laughed at the wrong parts of movies, how she would have adored him exactly as he was, flaws and all. My parents reached out, eventually. My mother more than my father. Letters at first, then a single supervised visit that Daniel agreed to mostly out of curiosity rather than any real desire for reconciliation. It didn't go well. It didn't go badly either. It simply confirmed what all three of us already suspected, that whatever relationship might eventually exist between Daniel and his biological grandparents, it would never resemble the one they'd stolen from his father. I see them now occasionally. Holidays mostly brief and careful. I haven't forgiven them. I'm not sure that's a thing I owe anyone, and I've stopped pretending it's a debt I have to pay just because they're my parents. What I have managed is something smaller and more honest. I let them exist at the edges of my life now, the way you'd let weather exist. Present, unwelcome, endured rather than embraced. 3 years have passed since that first dinner. Daniel got married last spring. A small ceremony. Nothing like the backyard wedding his mother and I had, but with the same kind of nervous, overwhelming joy in his face that I remembered from my own. I walked his bride's side of nothing, of course. That wasn't my role to claim. I simply sat in the second row and cried through most of it, the way fathers apparently do regardless of how strange the road to that pew happened to be. He has a daughter now, 8 months old, with Hannah's exact chin and a stubbornness that even at 8 months is unmistakably familiar to anyone who knew her mother. He named her Hannah Marie, and when he told me that over the phone, I had to sit down on my kitchen floor for a few minutes before I could say anything back. I am, against every odd that 22 years of grief would have predicted, a grandfather. Lost time doesn't return. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this one too often pretend that a happy ending erases the years that came before it. It doesn't. I will never get the toddler who learned to walk 40 minutes away from me. I will never get the report cards, the little league games, the heartbreaks I should have been allowed to help him through. Those years are simply gone, spent the way my parents decided they should be spent, and no reunion dinner undoes that math. But a future still exists. That much, at least, they didn't manage to take. Last month, Daniel asked if he could come with me to the cemetery. I'd been going alone for 25 years by then, 3 more since the truth came out, because I never stopped visiting that grave even after I knew what it actually held and what it didn't. Hannah was still there. That part of the story had never been a lie. We stood there together for a long time without speaking. The cherry tree too rose over finally in full bloom the way it always was that time of year. Daniel had brought flowers, white ones, the kind Hannah apparently would have approved of, though of course he had no way of knowing that. I'd simply mentioned once in passing that she loved them, and he'd remembered. He knelt down and set them against the base of the stone. CALEBBNNETT, it still read, even now. I'd thought about changing it. I never could bring myself to. For the first time in 25 years, I wasn't alone at that grave. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, looking at a name that was technically his and technically wasn't, at a headstone built for a death that had never actually happened to him, but it happened, in every way that mattered, to the both of us anyway. Then he reached out and touched the stone the way you'd touch a person's hand. And quietly, almost too quiet for me to hear, he said the word he'd never gotten the chance to say. Mom. A word he'd waited 25 years to say out loud. A word I had waited 20